Hi everyone, this is the Brandon Adams podcast. This is episode 4. I'm super excited to have one of really the most important people in my intellectual development the past 6 or 7 years, Ben Hunt. He writes the Epsilon Theory blog. I've read, I believe, every post of this blog. And I also used it occasionally as reading in the Ec 970 class that I taught at Harvard. I was teaching international macroeconomics, and I'd sprinkle in some Ben Hunt posts every once in a while. So Ben, it's a pleasure to have you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, Brandon. Thanks for this. I'm really looking forward to this.
So your pieces come out, I would say, on average every 2 weeks, and they're on the meaty side. I would say they often require a couple readings, but in the same way they're quite addictive. I've found myself really, I don't know how I stumbled upon your blog in 2012 but you've really kept it consistent since 2012. Is that right?
That's right, Brandon. So I started writing. I just wound down my hedge fund. We can talk about that. And I was trying to figure out, how markets had structurally changed, because they have changed. The structure of markets and the way that it's not just the old saying, you're not just playing the cards, you're playing the players. The way that one has to play the players in markets today has changed so dramatically since the Great Recession and particularly since the central bank response to those events. And so, like I say, I'd given all the money back in our hedge fund, which had, we got it up to close to $1 billion. And, we had done great in 05, 06, 07, and we had killed it in 08. We had a career year in 08. And, but I'll tell you, from March of 09 onward, it was like you went to the wall and you flipped a switch on our returns. You just, you flipped the light switch off. We never lost money for clients, but our returns flatlined. Because the way we were both playing the cards and playing the player, and very successfully, up until March of 09, it just didn't work anymore. Like I said, we never lost money, but when you're running a hedge fund, you're doing it to make money for people, and you're charging fees appropriately. So single digit returns and charging whatever it is we charged, it's just not intellectually honest, if anything else. So in the summer of 2012, we wound down the fund because I needed space to figure it out. One thing you learn about when you're managing OPM, when you're managing other people's money, right? That has to be your sole and overwhelming focus. Right, you can't be a dilettante in managing other people's money. That has to be your 24/7 all-in exercise.
So it was really important to push back from that and try to figure out how the world was changed, how the world of investing had changed. And so I started writing this note, that I grandiosely called the first of these publications a manifesto. How self-important is that, right? To call it a manifesto, and I was really just writing to myself. I sent it out an email to about 100 clients or former clients and colleagues, and I'll say, for whatever reason, and we can get into what those reasons are, it really struck a chord. So since then. Actually, I guess it was the summer of 2013, right, where I really started doing the writing. So over the past 6 years and a couple of months, it's gone from the 100 email recipients I sent it to, and we've got over 100,000 today, and it's all happened through word of mouth. It's all happened through just people forwarding an email or going to the website where I was putting these notes up. And when I say it struck a chord, and it was, look, I think I'm a pretty decent writer. It's what I like you. I was an academic for a long time. I started a software company, and then I got into this racket of managing money. But I've always been a writer all the way throughout. So I think I'm a good writer. But I think that what's really clicking with people, the chord that we're striking here, is that there has been a sea change, and it's not just in our markets, but also in our politics. It's the role of narrative. It's the intentional use of words and messages to impact our behavior. That's something that's explicitly done by central banks today, and I think it's a big part about why investing changed from March of 2009 onwards, what they call forward guidance. But we see it everywhere today, and so that's really been one of the main focuses of what I write about and how I think about markets and voting, right? Our lives as investors and our lives as citizens. And that's what I continue to try to do today, both to be better investors so that we can make money, right, in these markets, but also so we can be better citizens, so that we can, I hope, reclaim some of the autonomy, some of the again, this sounds too important, but the liberty that I think we've largely lost. Just not over the last decade, but over the last several decades. Anyways, that's a long-winded introduction, but that is how it started, and that is what I'm trying to do.
I love it. And the audience of this podcast does include a lot of poker players. I've long noted that poker players have a little bit of a pessimism bent, and you do have some poker in your background, which is not unusual for someone who came through the economics, political science profession at the time you came through. Game theory was very, very important at that time, and obviously poker has always been used in game theory examples. I've always found that poker players have this pessimism bias, and in myself, I find that it's a costly bias. It has been ex post costly, and the market repeatedly gives me feedback that I'm wrong in being too pessimistic. I can be quite stubborn in that I still sometimes believe that I'm actually right. But I would assume that maybe your positions were more pessimistic than market consensus at a lot of points in time, which led you to do well in 2007 and 2008, and then be somewhat frustrated in 2011, 2012. One of the concepts that I find most powerful in your writing is the interaction of politics and financial markets, and your notion that I believe no one else has mentioned this notion that markets have become a political utility, and governments act in a way that suggests that they think people are entitled to 8% returns forevermore. And not only 8% returns, but stable 8% returns. And this concept of markets as a political utility, obviously it comes somewhat from our lawmakers and how they jawbone the market, and also from the ever more important central banking community. And when you follow central bankers, which I think many of your posts, you do tend to really have an emphasis on this increasing central bank involvement in the economy. But especially in the last 9 months, the tortured language that they use to justify continuous new interventions is really quite remarkable. Like it's gotten to a point where any 2 to 5% pullback is enough to justify a new round, and this is just a change in how we operate economies and financial markets.
Well, Brandon, let me touch on a couple of points that you raised there. And the first is your notion about I'll call it the pessimism bias. We always remember our bad beats pretty well, right? As poker players, and that's true as I'll say as active traders, investors, as hedge fund PMs, and that's absolutely right. And this was part of what I had to figure out by winding down my fund and thinking about how the world changed, really starting in 2009 and then really picking up steam in 2012, in the summer of 2013, when Mario Draghi says whatever it takes, and then all of a sudden the euro is saved and European markets come running back. I do think that the market has changed, and the way I want to relate that to game play and game theory and the like is this. I think that one of the reasons that, as you say, poker players gravitate towards markets and investing is that, particularly in the derivative world, right, the options and derivative world, that world is always a zero-sum game. Right, so the derivative markets are, by definition, a zero-sum game, like a game of poker. Right, there's for the game as a whole, there's a winner and a loser. Right, there's not some kind of magical wealth that's created for everyone. In the playing of most games, and derivative markets are the same way. That was absolutely the way it felt to me when I was running my hedge fund in 2005, 6, 7, 8, and then even go the early part of 2009. It felt like that zero-sum game where you're going long, you're going short, you have winners, you have losers, and you're going to be a winner. And I played that game really well, and I think that's the world that's very familiar to a lot of people who aren't in markets right now, because that world changed, right? So when I say that it has become a political utility, what I mean is that you had a new player in the game, that being central banks, who have no interest in rewarding quality companies, whatever that means to you, and punishing crappy companies. That was the game, right? That was the game I played, and I played really well. Right, that I want to go long the companies that have some, catalyst, something that will make them succeed, right? And I want to short the companies that have some crappiness to them, right, where they're going to fail. When the central banks come involved and their goal is to lift the price to provide a tide that lifts all financial asset boats, you're no longer making a distinction between good companies and crappy companies. That zero-sum aspect of the game of markets, it goes away. And that's what I mean about it becoming a political utility, and that's why I think you very correctly noted, look, if the market's down 2 to 5%, all of a sudden it's, oh my God, we got to do something. We can't have this happen. And that environment where it's now, the game is no longer making a differentiation between, crappy companies and good companies. The game is now, all right, how much support are the political players providing for markets? That's a total change in the rules of the game and the entire nature of the game. So look, I'll tell you, since 2013, in my personal investing, I've been levered long. Right? Yeah, because it doesn't make sense to try to play that zero-sum game of markets when the rules of the game have changed, and where the meaning of the stock market or any sort of market has changed from being a capital market where capital is getting to private companies, and it's become this political utility. So it is that change in the rules that I think has really changed both my own personal investing, uh, but it hasn't changed what I like to write about because it makes me sad, right? This change in markets makes me sad. You know, why do we like to play poker? Why do we like to play markets? Because it's fun, right? Because we're good at it, and we're smart, and you know, we can try to separate the winners from the losers. So I'm sad that the nature of markets has changed in this sort of way, and I think that my writing connotes that sadness and frankly maybe how or ways in which it can go back. I don't know. But in my own personal life, my own personal investing life, I think it is important to recognize when the rules have changed, when the game has changed, and to play the new game as best you can, even if it's not nearly as much fun.
So one of the things that I respect about your writing is that you're uh, not quick to bring politics in there. You're fairly agnostic about politics. You're also careful not to make predictions. But having read your blog for as long as I have, you can read between the lines in certain ways. And it seems fair to say that you disagree with the way that Federal Reserve intervention has led to extremes in inequality, ways where it seems that it's long been known that we've responded to crisis by stimulating the economy. We often do it with monetary policy. When we stimulate in that way, it helps the wealthy because the monetary policy pushes up asset prices, real estate, stocks, all the things that wealthy own, and the rich get benefit, the poor get no benefit, and more to the point, we assume based on history that those monetary policies will lead to expected inflation at some point in the future, which will hurt the poor. So you're not only helping the rich, but you're hurting the poor. And we hoped, as economic observers, that the extreme central bank interventions of the crisis period would be, if not reversed, then paused as we mounted a recovery. But we mounted a recovery, and yet the interventions get more and more extreme, and there's no hope of reversals. So it really feels as if the wealthy almost step on the throat of the poor in the way that they conduct economic policy. And some of your recent posts have explored this view where there's not only is this happening, but it happens in a quite cynical way where some of the say powerful corporate heads will engage in buybacks for the stated purpose of efficient allocation of resources, but the practical purpose of sterilizing their stock option programs where they're making a lot of money. So I guess the poker player in you, constantly cynical about motives, you believe that, first of all, the way we conduct economic policy has gotten to an extreme level, and then people will ostensibly say we're doing something for capital market efficiency, but the practical result is enriching themselves.
I think that what the Fed did in March of '09, right, which is to enter the market and directly participate by buying stuff, right? What we call quantitative easing, right, or large-scale asset purchases, these LSAT programs, where they buy things, right? And what do they buy? They buy financial assets. They buy first U.S. Treasuries, and then more recently mortgage-backed securities, with the goal of propping up the price of those securities, and as a result, propping up the price of all financial assets. And I want to be really clear. I think that when the Federal Reserve did this in March of '09, I think it was exactly the right thing to do. I think it saved the world. I think that's the entire reason that that in the financial system that central banks exist. They exist to be that provider of what we'll call liquidity of last resort. They are there to put money into the system to buy stuff when no one else will. Right? It's if you remember the movie Pulp Fiction, right, where Uma Thurman is OD'd and John Travolta gets that syringe of adrenaline and puts it right into Uma Thurman's heart. That's what the Fed did in March of 2009 with QE1, and I think it was exactly the right thing to do. But here's what happened, right? You see the same thing happen in the 1930s. You see the same thing happening over and over and over again, where emergency government action becomes permanent government policy. And we can argue about whether that's good or that's bad, right? All I'm saying is it is. That's what's happened, right? Where this emergency government action becomes permanent government policy. And it, in a very real sense, I think that our monetary policy has been captured by the academics who, they don't play a real world poker game, right? And they don't, I think, adequately appreciate how what really drives markets and poker games, anything else you can imagine, what is constant is fear and greed, right? And it's the way that humans respond to the rule set that's provided to them, to the opportunities that's provided to them, to the dangers that's provided to them, and then they will maximize their behavior on the basis of fear and greed. And what we've had over the past decade, I believe, with this constant, again, I'll call bureaucratic capture of the price of money, has led to behaviors that are, quite rational. And anybody who's listening to this podcast will think, well, hell, I'd do the same thing myself, and I probably would. Don't hate the player, hate the game, but the game has been set up. The rules of the game have shifted, as I was describing a second ago, away from, I'll say, rewarding quality companies, punishing crappy companies, and rewarding the people who make those sort of distinctions in their active management of investment, to an era where, because the price of money is so low and will stay so low, that it's possible for now management teams to game that system for their own enrichment. And again, it's not evil, it's just human. It just but similarly, it makes me not just sad, it makes me angry, because, as you point out, the wealth inequality in this country and in many countries, it's not diminishing, it's accelerating. These are not mean reverting phenomena, right? They don't just go back to the way they were. And I think, in a very real sense, both politically and now in our markets, we have this widening gyre where we become more polarized over time, where the inequality becomes more pronounced, and ultimately this gets cashed out in conflictual, if not violent, politics. And that's what I'm writing about today, to call people's attention, right, to the games in which this widening gyre is accelerating, because we've got to start talking about ways to first slow it down and then try to reverse it.
So Jim Grant has this view of the Federal Reserve as both firefighter and arsonist, which I think is a compelling description of what happens now, because you have craziness in financial markets that stems from dislocations that the Fed introduces, and then those financial market dislocations cause something to go radically haywire, and that justifies the next Federal Reserve intervention, which then moves us farther and farther away from true markets. And it feels like it's going to be hard to get away from that process. And I would like to focus on a couple things. One, you seem to have complexity as a theme in a lot of your pieces, and complexity, it's always been dear to my heart, both in terms of looking at economies, financial markets, and just trying to manage a life. Complexity is a killer, and it's important to be able to cut through complexity. It's an important part of what markets do, right? You don't have to know what other people's interests are. You can just observe simple signals, prices, and do your thing. And complexity is reduced in the system. But it seems like central bank intervention has increased complexity impossibly, because no one knows what's happening to future price levels. We have no history of having negative interest rates. We have no history of continuous bank intervention in markets. And I know history is near and dear to your heart. So how is one expected to operate in this world? And I want to explore one other theme, because I know you and we shared a similar academic background. We probably had a lot of the same courses with a lot of the same teachers.
Yep.
And I'm a little younger, but I think a lot of our classes probably went the same way. And studying the long history of economic policy, it was always clear that the years around 2020, 2025 were going to be challenging from a government finance perspective, because we've known about the aging of populations, and we've known about the problems of entitlement promises, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, for a long time. The aging of populations is the most predictable thing we deal with in economics, and it was always clear that medical expenses were increasing at 10% a year, whereas all other prices were increasing at 3% a year, and that was going to be a problem when we had committed to pay for all of the desired medical expenses of our aging population. So we knew that these were going to be challenging years, and the big picture of government finance is playing out exactly as one could have expected. We now, this past year, had close to a $1.3 trillion deficit at a time when you had record low unemployment. And this is a booming economy, a booming stock market. One of the important lessons of 2009 was that a not often talked about consequence of income and wealth inequality is that the tax base becomes more levered, because you're so dependent on how the wealthy are doing that when say stock markets go down, the government inflows go way down. So people were absolutely shocked in 2009 when you had a $1.9 trillion expected federal deficit, when California had a $19 billion deficit. But arguably, the next downturn is going to bring even more red, right? Because California, to me, was pretty much a look at the future, because income and wealth is so divided there. And no one talks about the fact, all right, today Uber shares unlock, so founders can sell their Uber shares. When people are selling $1 billion in Uber shares, they're cutting a check to the state of California for 160 million. Maybe one guy is selling $1 billion in shares, cutting a check to the state of California for 160 million. Those are checks that go to the government at times like now. They don't go in a bus time. And we don't talk about the fact that, hey, 2019, isn't the state of California lucky to get this $160 million check from this person? We don't realize how levered the tax base is until we're on the bad side of leverage. And what seems inevitable is that in the next downturn, which might not even take much of a downturn, you're going to see a sea of red ink from governments. And it seems to me that a lot of the Federal Reserve intervention and central bank intervention is the fact that those guys were in class with us. They know this stuff, and they have to play defense. They have to find someone to fund the deficit, not only now, but into the forever future where the deficits are getting larger and larger. And so there is a true political game going on where they have to figure out, all right, how are we going to thread this needle where we have roughly what we need to survive in terms of government inflows without an insane inflation rate?
Challenge a little bit of this. And where we'll end up at the end of this, I promise, is your initial point about complexity, right? And the way that we as human beings have to deal with that. So I'll go ahead and give you the answer right now to that very fundamental question, which is, well, how do we make our way in this sort of world? And the answer is with profound agnosticism. So that's where we're going to end up, and I want to spend some time on that because it's, when I say profound agnosticism, I mean in a really profound way, right? I mean in very deep ways what I mean about being agnostic about these things. But where I want to start with this discussion is to challenge a little bit of what you're describing about the downturn and, you know, what's the reaction function of the Fed and the like to something like a downturn. You know, when I mentioned that we've really seen a transformation of the rules of the game away from the zero sum, or not the zero, but the kind of the zero sum play of the game and the ups and the downs and the winners and the losers, to a game where capital markets become a political utility. You know, my question would be, well, we're going to have a downturn? Really? I mean, listen, you just said yourself, right? That every time there's even like a 2 or to 5% decline in markets, or something like, you know, Q4 of last year, oh my God, right? You know, the world is coming to an end, and so we will do anything to stop that, regardless of its impact on the real economy. And that's kind of where I'm going on this, right? Which is that what we saw in the 2009 reaction to the great financial crisis, and we can talk about the ways in which this response took place, but the response of every government and market actor of size, the reaction was, never again are we going to allow a deflationary crisis, a deflationary shock like we saw in 2008, which we came so close to the entire system unraveling, right? You know, I've told this story before. You know, the day that Lehman went under, you know, I say we killed it in 08, and I had every position set up in 08, and that, even just that day, I was like saying, fuck yeah, I just made so much money today. And then I'm thinking about it, I'm, you know, because it's the zero-sum game, I'm doing great. And then it suddenly hit me, which is like, well, hang on, I know I don't have any, it's not that Lehman itself, you know, owes me money, but, you know, Goldman does, JP Morgan does. Well, you know, if they shut down the markets, if the whole thing comes unglued, right? If the casino burns to the ground, who's going to pay me? And that was the moment where it was like, all right, it's not a game anymore. The whole system is within an inch of becoming completely done. Right? And so there were a couple of programs that were initiated. It's not really TARP. The thing that saved the day was called the Temporary Liquidity Guarantee Program. Right? So this is when the U.S. Treasury came out. This was a few weeks after Lehman failed. And they said, if you are a federally chartered U.S. bank, you may now borrow money. You may now issue debt, unsecured debt, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, right? So that program, and look, within 2 days, Goldman Sachs becomes a federally chartered U.S. bank. Morgan Stanley becomes a federally chartered U.S. bank. And they issue tens of billions of dollars worth of debt, of funding, just to save themselves. That saved the whole system. It saved the entire system. And everything after that, the Federal Reserve with its programs of quantitative easing and constant intervention and constant talking, the forward guidance, the narrative effort, it's all as a result of that. And so and not just in the United States, all over the world, right? So the Bank of Japan, the ECB, the Bank of China, right? They've all kind of linked arms and said, we're never going to allow that sort of deflationary shock to happen again. We will do, as Draghi said, whatever it takes to prevent that from happening. And we've built up this enormous Maginot Line against future deflationary shocks. So if your worry is that, oh, we're going to have a downturn in markets and we're going to be down 20%, and then, oh, we won't be able to write, checks to, for tax revenues for the states, or the pension funds are going to fail, my answer to you is, well, why are we going to have a 20% decline? Why is that going to happen? It could have happened in the past, but if the game has changed so that capital markets are now political utilities, that can't happen. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't fail for other reasons, right? It just means that the attack isn't going to go through the freaking Maginot Line. You're not going to send the tanks across the Maginot Line because you can't, right? The tanks, and there will be tanks, there will be, if not a collapse, there will be a breakdown of the system in the future, the way that systems always break down, but it's going to come from a different direction. I strongly believe that different direction is going to come from inflation, not deflation. I strongly believe that crisis is going to come out of the other thing that you mentioned, right? The entitlement programs, the spending that the government has to do to stay a legitimate government. We're going to have more of that, not just more, but more, capital M, capital O, capital A, capital R. And the way to pay for that, because you can't just pay for it through taxation, is to cut the cord, to say, well, we don't have to pay for it through taxation. What I'm telling you is that it's no accident that we're running trillion-dollar deficits in this country. It literally doesn't matter anymore, because when the next step for all central banks to take, if there is a problem, oh my God, we can't tax people because that would provide this deflationary collapse. Well, we say, well, then don't tax for it, right? It's jubilee. It's you forgive the debt. You just eliminate the debt, right? You monetize the debt. That's what is coming, right? I don't care who's elected in 2020. We're going to have something like a $2 trillion spending program, fiscal spending program in the United States. If Trump's reelected, he'll call it an infrastructure bond. And if, Warren or whoever's elected, we're going to call it a green bond. But it'll be something like $2 trillion. And we're not going to tax to pay for that, right? The Fed will buy it. The Fed will monetize it. This is what happens next. And I'll tell you how it breaks down. In the same way that we've seen enormous inflation in asset prices, financial assets, the result when this sort of spending, this sort of policy gets into the real economy, is inflation there as well. And that's what starts to break down our system, and that's what breaks down our market system and the like. That's what's coming down the pike. That's something that central banks don't have the tools to deal with, because they've built this freaking Maginot Line over these scenarios that you were describing a few minutes ago, the deflationary shock scenarios. The next war is never the same as the last war. Our last war, the war we fought in 2008 on an economic front, was a deflationary war. That's not going to be the next war. And I think it's important to us as investors and as citizens, and this is where I'm going to go get into what does it mean to be profoundly agnostic, right? What we have to do as investors and as citizens is to not allow ourselves to be drawn into fighting the next war, to understand that the basic rules of the game can change, and to think, well, if the rules of the game change in this way, how should I react? But to think in terms of reacting, not in terms of predicting. Because predicting is not just, you're not just going to be wrong in this sort of environment. Predicting is dangerous. And that is, you're right, one of the big messages in what I write is that we shouldn't try to predict. We shouldn't take on that sort of hubris, but we have to be very clear-eyed so that we can react appropriately for ourselves and our families and our communities.
So, pushing back on your view, it's sort of dangerous to take old concepts from economic history and try to apply them today when everything has changed. But I nonetheless try to do that sometimes. Arguably, there's some old concepts from economic history that explain why we haven't had inflation yet. One concept is we've had widening income and wealth inequality, and it's long been known that the wealthy spend a lower proportion of their income and wealth. And arguably with uncertain times, that's even more true today, because there's a piece that I liked from several years ago by the blogger Robert Waldman, who talks about the demand for financial assets is like insurance against future possibilities, and the demand for insurance for what might go wrong is never ending. And so there is a tendency for wealthy to respond to their increased asset prices by just staying in wealth that they view as protection against future states of the world and not spend, and that explains why inflation doesn't really kick up. There's also a concept I like from Robert Shiller, which is the moral anchors of a bubble, by which he means that for a bubble in financial asset prices to sustain for a long period of time, you have to have the individuals who are participating in the bubble to not want to convert their financial assets to real assets, because if they did, it would be highly inflationary. So from Schiller's viewpoint, say since 1980, you've had financial assets of all types inflating at 10% per year, whereas the underlying wealth productive capacity of the economy is inflating at 3% a year. Clearly, that shouldn't happen for 40 years. And the thing that allows it to continue is that the wealthy are not in a hurry to say, hey, that's irrational to have financial assets inflate much quicker than the real productive capacity of the economy. I'm going to convert my financial asset wealth to real wealth. If they did that, there would be inflation. And so there's been the fact that they don't do it leads to the low levels of inflation that they observe. I am reluctant to think that we could have, say, big monetized deficits in, say, a couple years without having a big increase in inflation. Obviously, monetized deficits are nothing new, and the only predictive power that I've ever seen is if you look at the percent of government revenue that's funded by taxes. When that falls below 60%, there's never been a government that has stayed there for a couple of years and not had a hyperinflationary event. So
let me interrupt a second, Brandon, because we're not disagreeing on what happens in terms of, I think, and this is in fact exactly what I'm saying, that when you get this sort of spending, deficit spending in the real economy, then inflation in the real economy is the result, right? We're agreeing on that. What I'm saying though is that a response to that debt, right, is to well, there are only three responses to debt, right? You can grow your way out of it, right? And that's what everyone wants to do with debt. And unfortunately, the United States has not passed a point of no return. The United States can actually grow its way out of debt. But that it's becoming more and more difficult every year, where you add another $1 trillion to it. Most economies in the world today don't even have that ability to ever grow their way out of the debt we have. All right, the second option is to inflate your way out of debt, and I think that's clearly the direction where one way which is going. And the third way is to default on the debt, to um, austerity your way out of debt, and that door no country in the world is going through anymore. I mean, the austerity narrative is dead in this country. It's dead in Europe. It's even dead in Germany, for God's sake, right? So there's no narrative. There's no impetus to do more taxing to to alleviate the debt. On the contrary, the drive to do spending, to have fiscal spending, is overwhelming today. Which is why I'm saying that I don't care who gets elected in 2020, you've got massive fiscal spending issues coming down the pike. But here's my question, right? So if we're no longer thinking about taxes as necessary to pay for our spending, then why do we have taxes? Why do taxes exist? And I'll give you the answer, right? The taxes, then, the meaning of taxes, if it's no longer to pay for things, the meaning of taxes becomes justice. It becomes justice. And it becomes the justice in the minds of whoever's running the government at the time. So justice for our current administration means the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, right, which was a massive redistribution of wealth preferentially to corporations and to the rich. If it's a Warren government or whatever government, then the notion of taxation as justice becomes soaking the rich, right? And the reason that I think that we as citizens and investors, the reason I think this gets much worse before it gets any better, right, is that once you sever that link between taxes as a means to pay for something, and now you say, no, we're just going to do it. We don't have to pay for it. What do taxes mean in that world? And if taxes then mean justice, right, that people get their fair share, whatever that means to the politicians happening in charge in the time, that's an incredibly, I'll call it, civically violent environment. And that's the environment I think we're moving into. And that's the mechanism by which I think markets and investing gets shook, right? It doesn't get shook because, we have a recession or these deflationary shocks. No, we're not going to have a recession because we're going to be doing all this spending domestically. It's going to be, we're going to be forgiving debts, and everyone gets a job, and all of these issues to try to push money into the real economy. There's no recession there. There's no deflationary shock. There is, however, as you're describing, enormous inflation, and that's what breaks this, right? That's what breaks this, and it breaks us not just in markets, but it breaks us in politics as well. So I'm agreeing with your scenario, right, about what happens when you no longer are taxing to pay for what you're providing in the fiscal sense. What I'm asking, right, is that how do we as investors and as citizens, when we see that and the different directions that could go, and we can't predict which direction it's going to go, how do you survive that? How does your wealth survive that? How does your livelihood survive that? How does your autonomy of mind and freedom survive that? These are questions that we haven't, had to wrestle with in the United States for, over 100 years, and in Europe 70 years. But I think we're going to have to wrestle with them again, and that's why it's so important to get straight here. I think that the issue is not, oh yeah, we're going to have another 2008. The issue is we're going to have something different, and not different in a good sense, but different in a sense where we're not prepared for that at all.
So is it fair to say that you view the consequences of the long interventions that we've had to be either political in nature, where we get a political, like one political lurch or multiple political lurches that are destabilizing? So that's one outcome, or another possible outcome is a sort of Argentina-like hyperinflation destabilizing scenario. And as we know, inflationary events, they tend not to be stable because the velocity of money goes up at such times, and the tendency is once inflation happens, it tends to get worse. So do you see it as a combination of those scenarios in at some point in the future, or one scenario more likely to be true?
So this is what I mean about the profound agnosticism. All I can tell you two things. What I can tell you is that the fundamental rules of property and ownership and the government's relationship with individuals, those fundamental rules are going to change. I don't know in which direction they're going to change. I could see them changing in very different permutations, right? The other thing I can tell you is that I can predict with certainty is that, again, fear and greed will rule the day, right? So it's fear and greed, and it is not just risk. Risk is where you can assign a set of probabilities to an outcome, right? Where you are, in game theory, we talk about decision making under risk, and this is when you take on, expected utility calculations, and you're saying, okay, this is the odds of something happening. I've got some band of uncertainty around those odds, but I can make an expected utility calculation out of these future events because I can assign some probabilities to those futures. What I'm saying and what I mean by profound agnosticism is these are not decision making. This is not decision making under risk. This is decision making under uncertainty, where I can't even assign odds to these things, right? And any assignment of odds would be silly. It would just be making up a number for the sake of making up a number. And it doesn't mean that we have to just be chaotic or give up any sense of trying to plan our behavior when we're making decisions under uncertainty as opposed to decisions under risk. But it means we have to have a different toolkit. And the toolkit I think that is most appropriate for decision making under uncertainty is what's called minimax regret, right? Where the effort is not to try to maximize your outcome, that's expected utility, but minimax regret says I'm trying to minimize my maximum regret, right? When you're faced with situations of uncertainty, right, where I think that the fundamental rules of property ownership, of taxation, of all this, they're going to be up for grabs. I think that what we have to do is to follow principles of minimizing our maximum regret. And what that means for me personally is when I'm thinking about investing, I'll talk about investing first and then about politics second, but when I think about investing, it means pushing away from the casino table of public markets and finding and investing in real cash flows and real things that are really close to me, right? So, that'll mean different things for different people, right? But I think the common denominator for me, at least, in minimizing my maximum regret from an investment point of view is to find real cash flows and real things that are that are close to me, geographically that I can touch, that I can interact with on a daily basis. They're not symbols, that are not cartoons, they're not casino chips that I'm interacting with, but it's actual cash flows. As a citizen, I'm similarly focused much less on the symbolic and the national, and much more on the local, and what I can, the human interactions, the pack, as I like to talk about it in what I write about, that I can interact with. That's my minimization of maximum regret, my min-max regret strategy for an uncertain world as opposed to a risky world. Your results may vary. Your calculation of that will be different, but that's the process I think we have to undertake when we're looking out at a world where the fundamental rules of the game we're playing, I think, are almost certain to change.
That makes absolute sense. So, for a typical individual, you're saying throw out the conventional wisdom of the past with regard to investment management, career management, 60-40 portfolios and all of that, and really focus on making things as robust as possible.
Here's what I'm saying, Brandon. So what I'm saying is, you're smart enough to make up your own damn mind, first of all. That's what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that you need to be reactive instead of predictive. And people hate that, right? When for some reason, saying that you're reactive, that becomes like a dirty word. Oh, what do you mean you're reactive? Well, I go back to this, George Soros, who, an amazing investor, and I love this comment that he has. Somebody was asking him, he was telling him how he was currently, investing in something. I said, well, why do you think that? Or, why are you predicting that? And he said, look, I'm not predicting, I'm observing. I'm not predicting, I'm observing. And that's what all of us have to do. We shouldn't be imposing our view of what should happen or what will happen. We shouldn't be predicting. We should be observing and reacting to that, right? And by observing, I mean observing with clear eyes. Look, a 60-40 portfolio right now, being invested in public markets, so long as they are being used as a utility, right, where everyone is just trying to prop up assets, I'm going to stay levered long to that. But I don't believe that in my heart. This is not my permanent positioning, right? What it is my current reaction to the current observations I am making about the world. I'll give you another example. So, this diplomat, you were a history student like I was, right? So Lord Palmerston, he's the guy who said, look, England does not have permanent allies. We have permanent interests, right? And that's true for each of us as individuals, as investors. We don't have a permanent view on, well, you should, keep a 60-40 portfolio to the day you die, and, long-term, bonds, that's your answer to diversifying your equity risk. Look, that is a tactical decision that I'm prepared to make today. I don't have any permanent allies when it comes to investments in terms of permanent strategies. What I have, though, are permanent interests. And I'm going to observe and I'm going to react. And that's what we should all be doing, right? Because that's how we get through this. That's how we get through this.
So I want to ask you one more narrow question. I could talk for hours, but we're in 10 minutes, I promise you we will be done. I want to ask you about this concept of taxation as justice, and the new entry into the conversation, which is wealth taxes. It's funny. I wrote a book called Setting Sun during the crisis years, and I predicted that wealth taxes would come into the discussion at some point. And I'm very much a free markets guy in orientation, but my view is that I'm a free markets guy if we're starting from scratch. We're starting from a very weird place now, so I'm not necessarily free markets when we're starting from this very weird place. But I predicted its entry into the conversation based on really two things. One was, since financial assets have been the most subsidized industry area of the economy for 30 plus years, it would be somewhat reasonable as retribution to go to the holders of financial assets as a funding source. And the other reason I thought they would enter the conversation is because if you look at the 120-year history of government revenue or a 100-year history of government revenue, we've had a wide variety of different tax regimes. And we've hovered around 20% of GDP in federal government receipts. That's been true in super high marginal tax regimes and lower marginal tax regimes. We've hovered around that level. And we can debate why that's true. I guess when marginal tax rates go up, there is some truth to the idea that effort goes down or reporting goes down or something. But as expenses are going up, it's hard to raise additional money by increasing income taxes, and wealth in this country looms large relative to income. So in a way, it's not surprising that's come into the discussion. But we also know that it's very dangerous. Like if you start taxing wealth at 1% a year, why not tax it at 10% a year or 20% a year? What is your thinking about this new entry into the conversation, wealth taxes?
Well, so here's what I think. I am very much. Let me put it this way: we're going to come down in the same place, Brandon, where I am begrudgingly thinking that a wealth tax, I don't have a lot of problem with it, but we're going to get to that place from a different direction, right? So what you're saying, if I take correctly,
I'm undecided for the record. I'm undecided as a matter of policy. I was able to predict that it would come into the conversation. And I think it's a permanent part of the conversation now that it's been introduced.
And Frank, I'll go farther than you. I think a wealth tax has a place. I'll say that. I think it's got a place. But and this is important point, but my reason for it is different than the reason you were describing earlier as a revenue source, right? It's a tax source. I think my sense is we both agree that the argument that, a wealth tax should exist because it's just unfair for some people to be wealthier than others. I suspect that neither of us supports that, right?
Correct.
That to me is the worst of the arguments for a wealth tax, and it's kind of I'll call it the Bernie Bro light version, which is, it's just unfair for someone to make more money than another person. I think that's a crappy reason to have a wealth tax. I think that's a real infringement on liberty and justice for all, right? Imagine that. I get the argument you're making that a wealth tax, well, that's what you got to do to pay for something. My view is that, well, if that's your problem, then no, you really do need to spend less, right? As hard as that is. And frankly, when I say spend less, I'm not one of these guys who wants to, cut back on, the social net and stuff like that. I mean, if I were president, my platform would be to cut defense spending by, a third, just right there, right? I'd mothball, huge chunks of the military. I'd go away from having a two-war doctrine, all this stuff. Right? So I don't want people to think I'm this, oh yeah, you want to just kind of cut government spending and, let people take care of themselves. That's not what I'm saying. But I do not think that a wealth tax is justified on any economic ground, right? Either because, it's just unfair, or because, we need that to raise more money so we can spend more. I think then you have to cut spending. But here's where I do come down in favoring a wealth tax. My view is that enormous wealth, such has been created, over the last 10 years, and this all goes back, more than 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. My view is that enormous wealth creates unaccountable and permanent political power. That's my argument for a wealth tax, is that the political power of the, I like to call it the nudging oligarchy, right? Of the very, very rich, and the way that the very rich, in my view, have captured antitrust law, securities law, trade policy, monetary policy for sure, right? Tax code, as we saw in that particularly in that 2017, I think abomination of a tax act, right? The way that I see that the very wealthy have captured those the various points of the government spear, if you will, right? I mean, what is the point of the spear for government? It's your tax code, it's your monetary policy, it's your trade policy, it's securities laws, right? That is political power that I think has to be broken. And I don't know how to undo that political power without taking a flamethrower to the very rich, which is what a wealth tax does. I'm not happy with it. It bugs the crap out of me that this is where I come down on this. But I'm at a point where I don't know what else to do, because I see the entrenchment of the very rich controlling these points of the spear. And I don't know what to do other than, like I say, take a flamethrower to it. So, like I say, I think we end up in kind of similar spots, but maybe for different rationale.
Well, I do feel like it's going to be a permanent part of the discussion at this point, and it would be somewhat surprising if the tone didn't get more aggressive over time, because it's amazing how far the conversation has changed, like in a 2-year period.
Brandon, this is what I mean when I was talking earlier about how this leads to, if not physical violence, it becomes a violent civic society where it is that widening gyre, as Yeats would call it, where the center does not hold. And what I'm saying is that's not a mean reverting phenomenon, that it only ends after enormous strife and conflict. And in that strife and conflict, the political rules, they change, they always change. What we have to do as humans is to hold on and keep alive what I like to call the small L liberal virtues, right? And frankly, the small C conservative virtues, and not be captured by big L liberal and big C conservative, to not become, as Ionesco would have called it, a rhinoceros, right? And that's really hard when you're being besieged by these events, but it's so necessary, and that's why I find podcasts like yours, the stuff that I write, it keeps me sane, right? To know that there are other people out there who are wrestling with these same issues, and honest to God, we've got to stick together on this so that we can have these conversations, because it's the only thing that's going to keep us together.
Well, I agree. I'm so appreciative for this time. I was amazed when I reached out and you were willing to get on air with me. So I'm super thankful. And maybe a few years from now, when I'm on podcast number 150 or something, we can do this again.
Don't wait so long.
All right. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ben. I hope we'll be in touch.
You got it, man. Take
Bye.
care.